The Fed has lost its independence. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. We want the Federal Reserve Bank to be independent because we believe in the fallen nature of humans. So if you believe humans have a fallen nature, you don't give them power. This is where worldview separates liberals from conservatives. Liberals believe that business people are fallen and so they should be controlled, but that government officials are not. Conservatives believe, quote, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, as it says in Romans 3:23. History. How did we get here? In the book America's Bank, the epic struggle to create the Federal Reserve, author Roger Lowenstein explains the difficulty that resulted in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. It was classic political theater, replaying the same acts that separated Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson when they wrote the Constitution in 1787. Hamilton and James Madison wanted a stronger central government, and Jefferson favored a more decentralized government. Lowenstein, in his book, credits a German immigrant financier named Wartburg for selling the U.S. Congress on the idea of a central bank. The economy had experienced painful recessions leading up to the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. Privately owned banks did the opposite of what banks should do when heading into a recession. They restricted their exposure by making fewer loans at higher rates. That only extended recessions. Wartburg said the U.S. should be more like European banks with a central or European countries with a central bank. You're welcome to think about the water tower in your neighborhood as the central reservoir for water. When demand increases, more water is pumped up into the elevated tank. Wartburg suggested the same for a bank as a central reserve of money. When a recession started, the bank would move against the wind and offer more loans at lower rates. Selling a central bank to a populace who had escaped monarch rule in Europe was really difficult. Americans were descendants of people who had escaped European countries for the very reason Wartburg was suggesting we go back to. There was great animosity to giving government officials the ability to control the interest rate and the money supply, which is monetary policy. That's why, through very intricate political wrangling, we ended up with a decentralized central bank. It has 12 regional banks. 7 governors of the central bank are nominated by the President of the United States, and they're confirmed by the Senate. The Fed is not an agency of the federal government. Now, doesn't that sound strange? Then why is it called the Fed? Let me explain. The Fed is owned by the banks, which is another long wrangling that took place in 1913. The Fed is supposed to be independent. It was until 2020. But starting in 2008, when Barack Obama took office in the depths of the recession, Obama's fiscal policy led us through the slowest recovery of 11 recessions since World War II. So the Fed had to support his ill-advised policies of increased taxes and regulation. Interest rate was effectively zero for 8 years. That's never happened in history. I don't mean American history. I mean human history. While I was explaining this in class last semester, a bright student interrupted me to blurt out, "You mean they're paying people to take money?" He was right. I teach from a text written by a guy named Gregory Mankiw, who's in the Bush administration and teaches at Harvard. In the last edition, it said there could not be negative interest rates. Then the central banks of the European Union, Switzerland, and Norway produced negative rates. So the current edition says negative rates can only exist for the short term. Think about that. The Obama fiscal policy was so backward that economics textbook authors had to change the way they stated the rules of economics. Okay, that's history for you. Now the present. Where are we today? Well, then President Trump thundered against Jay Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, complaining that, quote, he almost seems to enjoy raising rates, end quote. During the next meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee, they lowered the interest rate. Gone in 10 years, what had been preserved for over 100. What's wrong with a dependent Fed? Here's what Senator Lamar Alexander said in the Wall Street Journal on December 2nd. He said, quote, "I don't want to turn over management of the money supply to a Congress and a president who can't balance the federal budget," end quote. Well, see, the government already is in charge of fiscal policy. When they take over monetary policy, the great fear of the 1913 antagonists has come true. A monarch controls the money supply. This happens in third world countries all the time, where they don't have an independent central bank. Leading up to election, government lavishes the public with money, and as a result, they get reelected. Now, Benjamin Franklin was right when he said, "When the people find they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the republic," end quote. I'm not sure if it's the end of the republic, but it's very bad news. I can't tell you how astounded I was about President Trump's recent complaint that the $600 the Democrats wanted to give to Americans in pandemic relief wasn't enough. He wanted to increase it to $2,000. In my country, I'm working on a witticism that goes something like this: the government gives people their own money and tells them they're richer. That's pretty accurate, actually, and it's technically true, because the government has no money. The government has no money. Its only source of money is its own citizens. It just takes from one and gives to another, but they're both citizens. Next subtopic, freedom. I often stand in the front of my class with my arms crossed on my chest and I explain, the nexus of Christianity and economics is freedom. The famous painting by William Holman Hunt features Jesus knocking on a door with no doorknob. That's because the door must be opened from the inside. Quote, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and dine with him and he with me." And that's from Revelation 3:20. If God gives us humans the freedom to accept or reject the invitation of the greatest being ever conceived in history, that's God, we have to assume he would want us to have as much freedom as possible in our economics lives as well. Now, not perfect freedom, that would deny the fallen nature, but as much freedom as possible. An independent Fed gives people freedom. A Federal Reserve Bank owned and controlled by the federal government robs people of their economic freedom. We are returning, I'm sorry to say, to the monarchies of Europe from which our ancestors escaped. In Federalist Paper 51, James Madison wrote, quote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary," end quote. In 1979, Phil Donahue was pressuring Milton Friedman about the negative impacts of free market capitalism. He tried to get Friedman to go to the socialist end of the spectrum. Well, good luck with that, because Friedman, of course, did not take the bait. Here's Friedman's response to Phil Donahue in 1979. Quote, "Where are you going to get the angels to run this centralized system of yours?" End quote. All right, isn't that fascinating? First, that Milton Friedman, who is an atheist, was talking about angels. Second, that in these 240 intervening years, you get James Madison and Milton Friedman saying just about exactly the same thing. See, that's where we started this discussion. The assumption of the fallen nature of humans. We're not angels. If we were, we wouldn't need government. And if government officials were angels, as Madison said, we wouldn't need an independent Fed. That's why I'm so upset about this. An abundance of counselors. How about this? In the introduction to the book The Wisdom of Crowds, James Surowiecki writes about Francis Galton's burning bush moment. If you're a Christian, you know what that means. When at 81 years old, Francis Galton discovers the average answer to an ox weight judging competition is better than the expert's answer. It's also the first and most important lesson you learn in a personal finance class. Diversify your holdings. That's because in abundance of counselors there is victory, it says in Proverbs 24:6. See, we have had an abundance of advisors when we had an independent Fed. When we have a dependent Fed, we lose that abundance. And we miss the lesson that Surowiecki teaches in the Francis Galton example, in the wisdom of crowds. Crowds are smart. Government's dumb. My students are often frightened to learn the world is not nearly as tightly wrapped as they want it to be. No one knows where the economy is. And no one knows where it's going. I don't know. Jay Powell doesn't know. President Trump doesn't know. Janet Yellen doesn't know. Nobody knows. That's why you need the input of multiple entities, and the more entities you get the input from, the better. That Fed Chairman Jay Powell and newly appointed Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen want to, quote, work together, end quote, should have you clutching your wallet and your purse. They think they know where the economy is and how to remedy it, but they don't. Friedrich Hayek called this a pretense of knowledge. In layman's terms, it said as, you're not as smart as you think you are. Or, in biblical terms, you need an abundance of counselors. What about the future? Well, predictions are difficult, especially those about the future, quipped Mark Twain. Till recently, the government had no say in setting monetary policy, which is interest rates and money supply. Fed is en route to becoming a federal agency. I spoke about this at length in podcast 21, which was titled Economic Humanism. Writing in the Wall Street Journal on January 3, economists Mike Salon and Phil Gramm, you may recognize his name, a former Texas senator, Phil Gramm predict, welcome to the era of non-stop stimulus. That was the headline. See, here's what happens. Humans do what works. During the pandemic, some $6 trillion of stimulus has been pumped into the economy without the predicted ill effects of inflation and currency devaluation. It's worked without harm, so they're going to continue to do it. And that's what they point out in this article, Salon and Graham say. It'll be nonstop stimulus, and they're right. But here's the problem. They're like Wile E. Coyote who ran off the cliff in a Roadrunner cartoon. He's floating on air. And when he looks down, he will realize gravity still works. This will happen to our economy. When and how fast? That's the topic of another podcast. For years, I've predicted a slow roll down a hill, meaning the valuation of our currency will roll down a hill. But as more time goes on and more stimulus is added, the opposite predictions, that is, of a cataclysmic drop, become even a better prediction. This last section is called I Find Myself Praying. Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote on December 2nd, quote, this isn't Fed independence. It is accommodating the political class with barely a whimper of debate, much less dissent. Modern monetary theory might not be the free lunch our current economic policy lords imagine. Someone should caution the Fed against giving up its independence so easily, end quote, from the Wall Street Journal, December 2nd. They're right, exactly right. Do you notice the term they used? Economic policy lords. I spoke about this in podcast number 31, which was titled The Myth of Modern Monetary Theory. In his song, Nothing Short of Dying, Travis Tritt sings, I find myself praying more than I ever did before. Yeah, that's Western philosophy from a country Western song. Me too. I find myself praying for our country's economy more than I ever did before. Because the end of the Fed independence means the end of a free market capitalist economy. In the forthcoming book, Biblical Economic Policy, Sergei Seidamatov and I state 10 biblical commandments of economics. Number 5 is use honest measures. A dependent Fed is the end of honest measures because government bureaucrats will determine the value of the currency, and it will be despairingly low. I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist, where our slogan is Fear God, Tell the Truth, Earn a Profit. See you next time.